A number of things helped lead us into war with Britain. The war that had been going on in Europe between France and Britain had often caused these two countries to attack our trade ships and had nearly led to a war with France at one point. But Jefferson had attempted the Embargo Act and then the Non Intercourse Act, and Macon's Bill Number 2 had both been attempts to try to stop these countries from attacking our shipping. In the end, France agreed to, but Britain was still attacking our ships. There were other factors also which helped lead to the United States declaring war in 1812.
There's a group of people called the War Hawks. And the War Hawks are mostly Westerners, and they're wanting to expand America and add Canada even. They think that's going to happen. They really think the Canadians would want to be part of America. They don't understand why they wouldn't. And they think war with Britain is the right move. So these guys are pushing for war with Britain, who has been violating our rights. The British have been, first of all, they've been stirring up Indian troubles on the frontier by trading with the Indians and giving them guns and maybe encouraging them to attack our settlers. And the British, they're straying across the Canadian border and setting up bases and putting troops in our land. And they need to go. And on top of that, they are attacking our ships, and they're impressing American sailors, meaning when they stop one of our trade ships, they then look at the men who are sailors on that ship, and if they're British, or they think they're British, they just grab those guys and stick them in their navy. That's how England actually filled their navy, was by just grabbing Englishmen and throwing them on naval ships and saying, you're in now. That was the law in England. Every Englishman, at the drop of a hat, had to serve in the Navy, which you can understand when naval power is their thing. So they're violating Americans' rights all over the place. And some people have had enough, and it's time for war with England. Now, of course, the Federalists, they're not going to be happy with this because they want to trade with England, and they like England. Yeah, maybe there are ships that are getting stopped, but they would rather have a few losses here or there than cut trade altogether. So it's these Jeffersonians, these Democratic Republicans, that are pushing for war with Britain. And so we finally end up declaring war on Britain. And we do it because we think by 1812 they're so busy fighting this war with Napoleon that they won't really mess with us in America, and we can go capture Canada, and this war will end pretty much in our favor. What we think is going to happen is we're not going to do so well at sea, but on land, we'll do well. We'll capture Canada. It ends up the opposite. As soon as we declare war, a very enterprising fellow by the name of General Brock, he's outnumbered in Canada, but he gathers the troops he can. He gathers Indian allies. And he first of all rushes out west, where we're gathering an army near Detroit, and he attacks our fort. And he tells our commander out there before he attacks the fort, he sends him a message and says, look, General Hull, I got to admit, I really don't have a real army that I'm attacking with. A lot of these guys are just savages. They're Indians. And when we get inside your fort, I can't promise you that I'm going to be able to keep control. And, natives, they might, do all kinds of atrocities to you. So I just want to warn you in advance, I can't control them. They fired one shot. And General Hull yanked down the American flag and surrendered. He is the only commander in American history to be condemned to death for cowardice. We didn't carry it out. He was an old guy, and we just let him die. But we did condemn him to death for cowardice. So he stopped that army. Then he rushed back east, where we were gathering an army in New York. And before we could invade Canada, he invaded New York. And he was winning the battle, but then he died. He was killed. And his army retreated. And at that point, our army crossed into Canada. Well, part of our army did. The United States Army crossed into Canada. But the New York militias that were led by Federalist officers, they would defend their state, but they were not going to continue this war with Britain any further than they had to. And they stayed on the New York side. So when the American army crossed with only part of our troops, we got routed and chased back. Our invasion of Canada was a failure. We were not doing so well on land, but surprisingly at sea, we were really seriously doing well.
Even though Great Britain had a much bigger navy than we did, the few ships that we had in our navy fought amazingly well. Our frigate, the USS Constitution, in the picture here, defeated a British frigate, the HMS Guerriere. Later, they defeated another British frigate, the HMS Java, and the U.S. frigate, the United States Constitution. It defeated the Macedonian. In addition to these victories by our large frigate-class ships, we also had a couple of our smaller sloops of war, the USS Frolic and the USS Wasp, cute little names for smaller ships. They also bested British ships. In fact, our ships did so well on the high seas that the British came up with a new plan. If a British ship sees an American ship, they're to run, unless they outnumber the American ship 3-1. The British started traveling in groups. They wouldn't take us on in single combat anymore. So we did surprisingly well at sea. And on the Great Lakes, Oliver Hazard Perry won a famous battle with his small fleet against a British fleet and took control of the Great Lakes. So our Navy actually was doing very well, while our Army was having disappointing setbacks. The worst setback we suffered, though, was really not our own, but Napoleon's. In 1812, Napoleon made the massive mistake of invading Russia. And this was his undoing. His army, although victorious on the battlefields, could not overwhelm Russia, and the winter set in, and his army was basically destroyed, and Napoleon was overwhelmed and defeated by the coalition of European nations. And all of a sudden, Britain no longer was fighting Napoleon. They could now turn their attention to punishing us here in the United States. The British decided that they would come to the United States and invade from 3 different directions. They would invade from Canada in the north, from New Orleans in the south, and they would also invade in the central part of our coastline near Washington, D.C. The first part of their invasion was set to come down Lake Champlain and down the Hudson River to New York City. So all they had to do was sweep the American ships from Lake Champlain, and they could load up their troops and sail downriver. So the British commander ordered one of his men to go up the hill and watch the naval battle and come tell him when the American fleet had been defeated, and then he could load up his troops and sail on to victory. Well, eventually the man comes running down the hill yelling, "They've surrendered, sir, they've surrendered." And he says, "Good, let's get this invasion going." And the guy says, No. Our ships have surrendered. We lost. A naval victory on Lake Champlain ends the invasion from the north. Now, the next invasion, however, did not go so well. The British landed troops south of Washington, D.C., and began marching towards the city. The United States Army, and full disclosure, I'm a Navy guy. So the War of 1812 is the Navy's shining moment. The Army has not a lot to brag about, unfortunately. So the Navy, when the Army runs, the Navy actually landed sailors to man cannons to delay the British, giving us time to evacuate Washington, D.C. And very famously, President Madison's wife, Dolly Madison, she stays to the last minute evacuating items from the White House, including famously a painting of George Washington. So she gets a lot of praise for bravely evacuating the items she can. But when the British arrived in Washington, they burnt the city to the ground. Now, they did that for a reason. We had made a second attempt to invade Canada, and we had invaded the city of Toronto, their capital. And during that battle, one of our commanders, Zebulon Pike, a hero who had explored the American Southwest and, got that mountain in Colorado, Pike's Peak named after him. Well, he was a big hero, and during the battle, he was near a building full of ammunition, and it blew up and killed him. and our troops got really mad, and we burnt Toronto to the ground. So the British returned the favor. They burnt our capital. Then they loaded themselves up in ships and sailed further up the Chesapeake, and they headed towards Baltimore, Maryland. And when they arrived at Baltimore, they began bombarding Fort McHenry. And if they could get the fort to surrender, then they would be able to take Baltimore. But you probably have heard this before. At least you'll be familiar with the song. There was a guest on board their ship. An American by the name of Francis Scott Key, under a flag of truce, had rowed out and boarded a British ship to negotiate with them, the British, for the release of one of his friends that they had captured. And while he was on board their ship, the ship had arrived at Baltimore and begun bombarding Fort McHenry, and he was told to go below deck and wait. And the next morning, the cannon fire ceases. And he runs up to the deck to see what has happened. And when he does, he sees that flag flying over Fort McHenry. So we didn't lose. We won. We didn't surrender. And it inspired him so much, he took out a piece of paper and he wrote down these words. "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed by the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there." So not only did the fort hold and turn back the British invasion, but we also eventually got our national anthem from this battle. Well, two prongs of the British invasion have failed, and quite frankly, the British are just here to put us in our place. They don't want us back. We're way too much trouble. In fact, the British are now negotiating over in Europe with our ambassadors to end this war. Unfortunately, we do agree to a treaty, the Treaty of Ghent. But before that treaty arrives back here in the U.S. to end the war, the third prong of the British invasion force arrived at New Orleans. And General Andrew Jackson has been charged with stopping the British. So he marches down there to New Orleans and he gathers a force of troops quickly. He's so desperate for troops, he even recruits Jean Lafitte's pirates to be part of this force. And they build a defensive work made out of big, thick cotton bales. They're actually standing behind cotton as a defensive wall, but cotton bales are big and they weigh about 200 pounds. They'll stop a bullet. And so the Americans waited, and the British marched across an open field and attacked, and we just started shooting them dead. And one of the first people we shot dead was their general. And that threw the chain of command into confusion. And so they didn't call back the troops. The troops just kept coming, and we just kept killing them. And it was a serious, humiliating defeat for the British. Well, when news that we had whipped the British at New Orleans started spreading north from New Orleans, word was spreading from the north that a treaty had arrived from Europe ending the war. And so Americans get this message that we have defeated the British and won the war. Even though in reality the war was a draw, nobody won, but we felt like we had won. And this helps lead us into what is called the era of good feeling. One of the big things that makes it the era of good feeling is us Americans feel this new sense of patriotism, of nationalism. We have won this war, or at least we feel like we have. And we worked together and we stood up to the greatest empire on earth and came out of it well. And America feels united. Also, there's no longer political division, at least not on the surface, because those Federalists, well, those stinkers during the war, since they didn't want to be part of a war against Britain, they had actually got together up north at Hartford, Connecticut, and discussed seceding from the Union. Well, they didn't do it, but it made them look unpatriotic, made them look disloyal, and when the war ended up being a success in most people's eyes, they looked like they were a bunch of un-American traitors. And nobody wanted to be a Federalist. And that was the end of the Federalist Party winning any major campaigns. And within a few years, the party was completely dead. Now, that didn't mean their ideology went away, but Federalists had to kind of go undercover as Democratic Republicans and work with that party. And so we have only one political party, and there's a sense of national unity. And in the midst of all this, we're going to see the nation working together more closely than ever.
During the era of good feeling, we have a new unity which is demonstrated by one of our greatest politicians, Henry Clay. He's from the West, but he encourages the North and the South and the West to all vote for programs that benefit all of America. So like if the North will vote to build roads out west, the West will vote to help raise the tariff to protect northern businesses. And so this is the American system that Clay ends up pushing for. And he will get the national bank rechartered to benefit Northerners in exchange for benefits for the West. However, the big thing is it usually ends up being the South that's kind of left on the outside looking in. Westerners and Northerners get together, but oftentimes the Southerners really don't get much out of this American system. But we're still in this era of good feeling. And so Madison finishes out his period of as president, and then his Secretary of State, Monroe, becomes president. Now, when Monroe becomes president, the thing he's best remembered for is something called the Monroe Doctrine. Down in South America, and Central America, and in Mexico, Spanish colonies were fighting for and winning their independence. Now, we were rooting for that because that's what we did, and we're proud to see our ideals spreading. We're also looking at that as an opportunity that we can now go in and start doing business there, and so does Britain. Britain looks at it as an opportunity too because Spain no longer controls it. Britain can now go in and trade there. They don't want to own these colonies. They just want to trade there. So Britain actually approaches us and say, hey, U.S., now that we've kind of had our little war and we're buddies now because this is actually the beginning of a U.S.-British relationship that's going to be positive, Britain suggests that together we issue a declaration that no other European power is allowed to come over and try to recapture these new republics. But our Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, he recommends to President Monroe that instead of doing this with Britain, we just make the announcement ourselves. And so we do. The United States issues the Monroe Doctrine where we say that we're not going to allow any European country to come over to America and try to take over these particular areas. We're going to protect this whole region. Now, the fact of the matter is, us with our tiny little navy, our tiny little country, we couldn't stop any of them from doing it. But Britain has our back because it's in their best interest to do it. And so for the first, 60 years of the Monroe Doctrine, we're not the ones enforcing it. Ultimately, though, the United States will grow up and become powerful enough to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And what's a little ironic, as you'll see in History 1302, the first country we ever enforced the Monroe Doctrine on was when Britain had a border dispute in British Guyana in South America with Venezuela. And we stepped in and said, Monroe Doctrine, you can't invade there, Britain. We'll decide where the border is. So the U.S. is taking its first little step into world diplomacy where we're going to protect the whole half of the world. And ultimately, someday, we'll be big enough and strong enough to actually do it. So, this was the Jeffersonian period, the era of good feeling, but those political divisions didn't go away. And as we're going to see in the next unit, eventually those political divisions will cause new political parties to form, and we'll see our country continue to grow.